Okay. Okay. For those of you who knew what I used to do with these recordings, and by the way, if anyone has any problem with putting this up on YouTube, just let me know. I won't put it up if anybody's concerned for their well-being, that they might be stalked or something. Just let me know. I'll take it down. But normally I put them up there on our YouTube channel for those who couldn't make it, who might want to, watch what we talked about, or for us who, if we want to review it or not. But just so you know. And all right, so we'll get started. Okay, the topic started out really, it was kind of provoked by this little quote from Strawson, but it really isn't so much about about taking philosophers in general seriously, although there's a long history of people taking them pretty seriously, but more specifically about the free will determinism, because this whole the thing Strawson is talking about is specifically about there are some people who take this stuff very seriously, including I'm not sure to what extent professional philosophers do. I mean, as far as in their lives, if they're hardcore determinists, do they go around being passive about things and not making decisions like the rest of us do, or not? I suspect that's partly what I want to get into, because I want to try to show, or at least offer some arguments or reasons why neither determinism nor free will, they're both problematic. And what's interesting is they're problematic even if apart from the other one. In other words, even if determinism were true, it's still, that's not the biggest problem with free will. And I'm going to try to make a case that determinism might well be true, but it's irrelevant to any human concern. Free will might well be true, but it has a different problem with having to do with a conceptual problem, with an epistemological problem. Is how do you know when you're engaging in an act of free will? It turns out that's not as straightforward as one might think. And so in the end, in a way, both of these views, it could be that free will is an illusion. There's a reason to believe that determinism might be an illusion as well. They could both be true, and yet it doesn't much matter as far as there's not enough there for anyone to take either one dead seriously. That they're conceptually fascinating, that it's worth thinking about for those of us who are interested in philosophy. That's still fascinating, but to draw a flat conclusion that determinism is true and therefore I'm going to change my life, that seems very unsportive, and I'll try to explain why. And those who, on the other side, those who believe firmly in free will, have a problem, a different kind of problem that has nothing to do with determinism, but it's a problem that would be there even if determinism was not true. It still would be a problem. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for the most part. And I'm going to try to present some parts of this, and then I will pause periodically for people to ask questions and argue with me or disagree or whatever. It's okay. So for those of you, I have to define some basic terms for those of you who don't already know this. But the understanding of hard determinism that we'll be assuming here is basically the idea that every event that happens in the universe is the way it is because of some prior event, or perhaps even more accurately, that the entire state of the universe, this moment, is what it is because of the state of the universe one moment before. And that moment is the way it is, or is the way it was, or was the way it was because of the moment before that, and so on and so on. And that nothing happens without having been determined by something that came prior in time. If that's true, it does seem, at least superficially, to rule out the possibility that any one of us could engage in any kind of event or bring about any event and be responsible for that event, in the sense that the buck stops with you, whereas determinism is saying that the buck doesn't stop. It just keeps going back further and further, and forever, whatever, depending, or to the beginning of time, if there is such a thing. And one understanding, there probably are alternate understandings of these concepts, but one understanding of free will that I'm going to assume here is the agent causation understanding. The free will, the most coherent defenses that I've heard of free will is that most free will thinkers, philosophers who thought it through, do agree that most, if not all, events in the universe are caused by something. The only thing they disagree about is that they think there's a special class of events called agents, which we humans might be examples of, that can make things happen independently of whatever is going on in the natural world. There's event causation. That's where events, impersonal things and events in the world bring about other events. Then there's agent causation, where there's these peculiar metaphysical beings, of which human beings might be one kind, that can make things happen without themselves, without their actions or their will to make that thing happen itself being the result of an event that was caused by things outside the agent. That's agent causation. So a defense of free will suggests that there are such beings, that there are these beings who can break out of causal chains, of natural causal chains, I should say, and become themselves the beginning of a new causal chain. And I'm not going to be talking too much about compatibilism. Compatibilism is the view that somehow you can have it both ways, that the world really is deterministic, and at the same time, in some sense, people do have free will. One version of that, which I don't find very convincing, but apparently people used to or still do, is that it's just, to me, it's a matter of, it sounds like they're just playing with words. They say, well, the world is deterministic, but we as humans, as long as we don't feel that we're being constrained or some external force isn't forcing our hand, or no one's putting a gun to our head to do something, and as long as we feel that no one is forcing us to do something, or nothing external to us is forcing us to do something, then we have free will. Okay. The reason I don't find that very convincing is because it's quite possible that external things are causing you to do things, you're just not aware of them. And it's awareness of whether something's causing you. But in other words, that's a very cheap, very low-level kind of free will. It's basically just nothing interferes with my decision, therefore I have free will. But that assumes that you know what's actually bringing about your decision. And for example, one view is that I'm free whenever I do something because I desire or want to do it. Okay, so the next question is going to be, well, what gave you that desire to do that thing? And then you could keep on going. Well, I had a desire to have that desire to do that thing, and so on. And each one of these have levels brings about the next one, the other one. But if you keep going like that, what is the source of the original desire to have the desire to do the thing you were going to do? And it seems like you're back to determinism. I don't find that convincing as an explanation of free will. It just seems to be a cheap move to have it both ways. A more convincing version of free will is one that simply says there are exceptions to the laws of nature. We are such an exception, the agent causation view. And so anyway, I'm not arguing for these, I'm just trying to explain these positions. There's also a third view there that I'm not going to talk too much about, but if it happens to be true, then it cuts out both determinism and free will, and that's indeterminism. Perhaps, as you mentioned, at least like something about quantum theory, if ultimately, although mostly at some very low level, perhaps things are random and indeterminate. Nothing brings about anything with any kind of, necessity. If that's the case, and if somehow that affects things at the large scale that we live at, then maybe that determinism isn't true, but neither is free will, because free will, the whole point of having free will is the idea that you want to be held responsible both for the good and bad, or to be praised if you do something great because you made it happen, or be responsible or blamed if you do something wrong. It's connected up with moral attributions. And so indeterminism, if it were true that nothing ever causes anything to happen, the world is one big crapshoot from beginning to end, then there's no free will and there is no determinism either. But that view is not widely held by too many people, although I happen to be kind of sympathetic to it myself, but I'm not going to be talking too much about it. So what I want to focus on, start this out, the real controversy today, is to talk about what is wrong with determinism. And I see there's two major problems with it, and what is wrong with free will. And there's one, there may be more than one, but there's one that I think is a pretty big one that's wrong with it. First of all, determinism is, the two things that I'm going to start, but I don't know if any of you got a chance to watch the short video that's in the link to Richard Holton. It's a short video about the difference between determinism and foreknowledge. He argues, and it's a very simple, short little video, and I highly recommend it. There's a longer paper there if you want to read it. But it really comes down to this, that determinism, he argues, is a metaphysical thesis. It's about how the world really is, how it really works, independent of us or anything we think or know or imagine or believe about it. It just describes the world the way it is. It's a thesis that says everything has a cause, that's every event is brought into being by other events became before it, and so on, ad nauseum. And but there's nothing in the concept of determinism that says that it has anything to do about what we can know. There's another, if it's possible that determinism is true, but we can never know that it's true, then what lessons can we draw from it? He argues none. It may be the case, but it has no effect on us. What does have an effect, and why he thinks some people do get riled up about determinism, is because they mistake determinism for foreknowledge. Foreknowledge is the view that somehow, with enough information, we could actually predict what will happen in the future. Now that, he argues, is a threat to free will. If we could ever understand the laws of nature and the initial conditions that bring about every single event, if that were possible, and if we had that vast amount of information necessary to make accurate predictions that rise to the level of being knowledge. We're not talking about probabilistic predictions. That's not a threat to free will. That I will probably do something is not a threat to my free will. That I will do it is a threat to your free will. So it's the certainty about future events that is really a threat to free will. And what he argues is that even if determinism is true, it does not follow that foreknowledge for beings like us is possible. And he explains, it gives a simple, illuminating example of why that's the case. And if that's true, if we mistake determinism for foreknowledge is a serious threat to free will, but determinism is not, because determinism is not something we can ever access, whereas knowledge is what we really fear. We fear that someday or someone or something might be able to predict what we're going to do 5 minutes from now, or a year from now, or even a moment from now. It's that fear that our future, the future events that will happen for us are predictable. That is the scary part of determinism. And he argues that scary part does not follow from determinism, even if determinism is true. How does it? That short video does a nice job, but I'll summarize it here. He conducts a thought experiment to illustrate this. Suppose that, okay, here we go. Okay, suppose you were tasked with predicting whether a light bulb screwed into a socket on a box would be on or off at a given time in the future, say noon tomorrow. And you would be supplied with knowledge of all the laws of nature, all the computing or thinking power in the universe you could possibly want You would know how to use it. You would have full knowledge of what's in the box. There would be no fact or law about the universe that you would not already know. You'd be granted that. Okay, and all you have to do is predict whether or not that light bulb screwed into the box will be on at noon tomorrow. So it seems to him that if it were possible for you to have that kind of deep knowledge of the physics of the universe, that it would be a simple matter of predicting whether that light bulb would be on at a given time. Well, there are a couple of catches, though, which is a little thought experiment, but they shouldn't affect, and we'll see why in a moment. One is the way that you're going to make your prediction is to switch on a light bulb of your own that is within a line of sight of the bulb whose behavior you're predicting. You'd have complete control over that light bulb. If you switch your light bulb on, you're in essence communicating your prediction that that light bulb, the one, will be on. If you leave your light bulb off, you're predicting that that other bulb will be off at noon tomorrow. So that's how you communicate your prediction. And again, you have full knowledge of all the facts and laws and all the physics and computing power and thinking power in the universe. So with all that information, it does seem, at least superficially, like you would be able to predict the behavior of that light bulb. But he says okay, the other catch is that you have to make your prediction 5 minutes before noon, 5 minutes before that the prediction is supposed to be realized at noon. So at 11:55, for example. And there's nothing really that important about the time, just that it be before the actual event, because obviously if you waited too long, you'd be reporting, not predicting, and that's irrelevant to the issue here. So then he tells you what's inside that box. And what's inside that box is something very, very simple and easy to understand. Inside the box is a photosensor that's focused on your light bulb. And it's wired so to do the reverse of what you predict. So if you flip your light bulb on, it's going to trip a switch in there that will make sure that bulb is off. If you leave yours off, it will trip a switch inside that box to turn that light bulb on. In other words, this box, this little device, is designed to frustrate whatever prediction you make. It's going to be the opposite. And it's extremely uncomplicated. He calls this an example of a frustrator. A frustrator is a thing in the universe that can react to information in such a way as to frustrate it, to make it come out, whatever the prediction is, it will do the opposite. And he says if even a simple device like a photosensor can frustrate a prediction, how much more so can much more complex entities like human beings can frustrate predictions. Now, you might be thinking, well, but if you know this and you are told in advance what's inside that box, you know that then you would be able to predict, well, the machine's going to do the opposite of whatever I predict. Well, how useful a prediction is that? It's like saying, the old song, que sera, sera. It's like what the bulb is going to do, what the bulb is going to do, but that's no prediction at all. The idea is that or it would be like a meteorologist predicting what the weather would be tomorrow by saying there will be weather tomorrow. They're not giving you anything very interesting or useful information. So that kind of prediction is nonsense. So if a simple device like this can frustrate even someone with all the knowledge, all the physical knowledge of the universe available to them, how much more so could something much more complex like a human being be able to do to frustrate prediction? So what he's saying is the possible existence of these frustrators, and it seems to him that the universe could be crawling with frustrators, makes the leap from the truth of determinism to the fact of foreknowledge impossible. Even if there really are causes. Now, to someone outside the system, to someone like an omniscient being outside the physical world, who wasn't themselves governed by laws of physics, they would be able to know exactly what's going to happen, but not anyone whose behavior is inside the system, because the system there's no, for us, and we are all in that system, there's no stepping out of that system on the assumption that determinism is true. And this assumes that his thought experiment assumes that determinism is true. So assuming it is true, the possibility of foreknowledge is frustrated by a simple device like he describes. And if so, he thinks that that is what people really fear when they fear determinism. They're afraid not that it's metaphysically true, they're afraid that it could lead to them or anyone being able to predict future events with absolute certainty. And he tries to show through this experiment that that's not possible. And the important thing here and the distinction here is that determinism is a metaphysical thesis. It's about how the universe is or how it works. It makes no reference to anyone or anything knowing anything about it, just that's how it works. Foreknowledge is an epistemic claim. It's about what beings inside the system, like us, might claim to know about the future. For us, the only thing we can do is base our predictions, is to make probabilistic predictions based upon past evidence, induction, just what we've seen happen before 1,000 times. That's our only basis for making future predictions. But probability never rises to the level of certainty. It's always, as I said earlier, that I probably will do something is no threat to free will, but that I will do it is a threat to free will. So what he's suggesting is that will part does not follow from the probability part. That because even if determinism is true, foreknowledge does not follow from it. Not even in principle would it follow. To beings that are inside the system, that is. Somebody who was outside the deterministic system, outside the natural world, who wasn't governed by the same rules that we are, perhaps to such a being there might be, but not for us. So foreknowledge, he says, it's impossible, and that is the real threat that people are reacting to when they worry about determinism. So now what does this show? Now it's important, he stresses this. This does not show that we have free will, nor does it show that determinism isn't true. It's assuming determinism is true. What it shows is just one thing, that whatever it is that's threatening our free will, it isn't determinism. It could be something else, but it isn't determinism. It's like there are two games that are being played on according to different rules on different playing fields, but determinism is not in the business of telling us what the future will bring. Foreknowledge would be, but we don't have access to that. So that's his attempt. What he's essentially doing is defanging determinism. Whatever threat people see in it is an unreal threat. It's foreknowledge they should be afraid of, and that he tried to show is not possible. So I want to pause right here, and before we go on to this, and did anybody have any reaction? Did you understand what this experiment, or what do you think? I also recommend watching the short video. It's only about 7 minutes long, where he explains it himself. He also has a paper that explains it in greater detail. Go ahead, Bill. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, that was great, Victor. That was a great summary of all those points.
That was very interesting. I agree.
Yeah. It sounds really simple. And I have to admit, when I first heard it, I thought this is a bit too simple. But it's important to keep in mind that he's not proving that we have free will. It's possible we still don't have free will despite his experiment. All he's saying is that whatever you're afraid of, it isn't determinism. What you're really afraid of is foreknowledge, and foreknowledge is inaccessible to us. That still leaves.
Got it. Can I say a few things?
It leaves open the question about whether free will or determinism is true. But
got it.
Okay.
Can I say a few things?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it was clear what you're saying, that he's saying. First, this notion of agent-initiated causal chains that you were discussing in the prior segment of your presentation, when you discussed philosophical arguments in favor of free will and one form that those arguments take. Agent-initiated causal chains is a significant concept from my point of view, for the following reason, which I will say something briefly about now and circle back to later as we continue our conversation today. So I do not have a degree in philosophy, but I do have a PhD from UCLA in political economy. And in the field of political economy, we explain human behavior and group behavior and group outcomes of individual behavior. And we have models of human behavior, of individual human behavior. And there's a debate among political economists that exactly mirrors the debate among philosophers between determinism and free will. And it uses different words for that axis of debate. It doesn't use determinism and free will. It uses two different words, but it's essentially the same debate. The two words that are used are structure and agency. It's called the structure agency debate. And the structural position in that debate is that humans have no agency. They've got no freedom of leeway, of choice in any situation. Their behaviors are completely constrained by structure in a way that's beyond the individual's control. Their behavior is completely determined by structural factors that are beyond the individual's control, 100% determined. That's the structuralist position. The agency position in that debate says, yeah, structure does pose a constraint, but it's not 100% determining. It's 80% or 90% determining. There's that residual 5 or 10% leeway that the agent has, that the individual has, where they can initiate a causal chain one way or the other way, and it's up to that agent which way they choose. And it truly is a free choice. It's not a choice determined by structure. It's a truly free choice. So that's the debate. I wanted to put that on the table because the debate has raged among social scientists for a long time, for at least 50 years, on some accounts, 100 or 150 years. And it's essentially the same debate. And the reason to put it on the table is because those who argue in favor of agency, they have ways that they make that argument. They have ways that they talk about human behavior in terms of agent-initiated causal chains. And as the conversation continues today, I'm going to be listening with one ear, and with the other ear, I'm going to be doing a quick literature search in the journal article database to see if there's a review article that summarizes the way the agency position people talk about agent-initiated causal chains. So that I just wanted to chime in and say that's where that's the angle I'm listening from today. So please continue, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, do you have yourself a point of view on that debate, or not, or do you lean toward the agency?
I do.
Yeah,
I do. I have a fairly well thought through and articulated kind of position on the relation between structure and agency, but I have not yet figured out how to articulate it to philosophers, because you guys kind of frame the debate a bit differently than social scientists frame it, and framing is everything. And in that respect, I'll just say this. I think it's a really useful exercise you're engaging in to look at the way these debates are framed and to kind of reframe them and deframe them in the ways that you're doing today. I think it's really useful because sometimes a debate is a false debate. It's actually not a debate. Or sometimes the debaters are talking past each other because they haven't framed the debate in a way that can produce productive exchange. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how you continue to deframe and deconstruct and reframe this whole set of debates. And I'll somehow figure out a way to talk to philosophers about the structure agency debate, maybe today or maybe another day.
okay. Okay, thanks, Phil. Anybody else want to chime in now, or any thoughts? Okay.
I have a thought. How do you account for chance?
Like just randomness.
It's
Yeah.
not random. Chance is an actuality in our universal structure, because without irregularities, we wouldn't be able to have the idea of laws itself. And it can't be an absolute chance, because that's a contradiction, because even an absolute chance is a type of order.
Mhm.
But in reality, we use chance as an irregularity that actually exists, not subjectively, but objectively, in the sense that chance is what gives us the opportunity to have laws itself, or the nature of law itself. So I know you didn't want to go into the what was the word you used?
Indeterminism?
Indeterminism.
Yeah.
I kind of move towards that in a sense. I'm a Peirce scholar,
Mhm.
and he has a theory of chance, of irregularities, that is not necessarily an absence of any coincidence, because he does believe in natural law, but he does say that the objective concept of chance is necessary for us to even move around in our own universe and environment. So
Mhm.
chance is very much a kind of almost free will in itself, if you look at it in those terms, what he calls tychism.
Mhm.
And so I kind of move towards that, because natural law itself is not determined. And we know that now from quantum physics. It's definitely has problems for us now that we didn't look at before. It's become popular now in the literature. And so I kind of, the old philosophical concepts of free will and determinism, I've looked at them through Kant. I've looked at them in St. Augustine. I've looked at them through, who else put one, a really good one forth? And the modern analytical concepts of them. And they just seem so dichotomous. It's one or the other all the time. And in actuality, in a metaphysical, mathematical way, because everyone who's not a philosopher and thinks metaphysics is just poo-poo, actually would have to think about a mathematical metaphysics in which chance is in actuality, and I'll quote Aristotle, in actuality necessary for us to have both free will and determinism. And I know you didn't want to go there, but I kind of moved towards that because I used to get so irritated with free will and determinism.
No, no. It's not. I'm sympathetic to the idea of indeterminism, actually, but I rarely hear people get riled up about indeterminism. Most often it's between determinist and free will. And that was the focus of this topic. By the way, we're always open to other people doing topics. If you'd like to do a topic on this, let me know. I'd be happy
Well,
to.
I'm writing a paper right now on quantum physics, relational quantum physics, using Charles Peirce's concept of existent, non-existent reals, which actually, it seems to be tapping into everything that I start to think about, like determinism, free will. Everything is now in question and is up in the air. I've been studying it. I'm not a physicist, but I do have a background in the philosophy of science. And lately, a lot of it, I draw myself in the middle because I don't really know what to think anymore. I used to think I knew something, which I really didn't, but now I really don't know. And
Yeah.
so I'm just curious how you view that kind of sort of a new look at reality. I would like to talk about what is reality again, and
Sure.
and include a metaphysical, mathematical concept, as opposed to everyone poo-pooing on a subjective metaphysics of Kant or something like that. I want to really look at it again because we're bringing it, metaphysics, we kicked it out the back door to let it back in the front door. And that's what's happening now. So I would like to do something on reality and existence. I know that's kind of really basic, but I'm kind of going back to basics. I want to review those again. I'm kind of questioning it all again. So that would be really interesting. I don't know how you all feel about that. I know I knew. So
No. Yeah, we're always open to people who know something about philosophy and would like to present on a topic that they know something about too. So yeah, if you'd like to host a topic, let me know, and we'll schedule it whenever you like it. Like,
I would love that because this paper is
Okay.
driving me nuts, and I
Sure.
really would like
Yeah.
to be able to
Yeah.
converse about it.
Yeah, send me a message, and we can arrange a time whenever it works for you to do that. My take, I tried to stay away from the metaphysics, and actually the focus on this topic is mainly on the epistemology and the epistemics of free will, which turn
Right.
out to be a problem apart from what's going on. So in other words, on the determinism, indeterminism question, I tend to be kind of agnostic about it. I think there's some
Yeah.
serious problems with determinism, and which I'm going to get to in a moment, but
Okay.
I'm not sure what the consequences of those problems are for indeterminism. To me, indeterminism is to me has always felt like a real possibility, because it seems to me that again, partly it's because of our relative insignificant place in the universe. How could we ever begin to know the laws of nature? It seems to me impossible and just hard to conceive
They're
that.
fallible. I mean, seriously, especially now, fallible.
Yeah,
We're actually not being able to measure what that is.
yeah.
And that makes everyone crazy because then, well, then what is it? How do we, if we have to use an objective observer, bad news kind of thing. So yeah, I know what you mean.
Okay. So, all right. So, but for this topic, I am going to be focusing mainly on separating the epistemic problem of the threat that determinism is sometimes mistakenly taken to be a threat to our daily lives, because it seems to suggest implied foreknowledge, when in fact it doesn't. And there's that. I mean, there's another problem which I'm going to talk about with determinism, which I'm going to talk about right now, which is has to do with normativity. And this is my own area of expertise, which is I'm interested in
before you do that,
what?
Could I say something in response to what Lisa said before you go on to the next segment of your presentation?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. I want to address Lisa's proposition that randomness is a necessary condition.
Chance, not random. Different.
Oh, I was using randomness as a synonym for chance.
And not the same.
Could you spell out the difference, Lisa?
Chance is an irregularity that occurs often. It's not something that just pops out of nowhere, not in a spontaneous way. It is a part of our actual world, you could say, and it's actuality from potentiality, if I use Aristotle's words.
Yes, so social scientists use the word randomness to describe exactly what you just talked about.
Okay.
So for social scientists, the word randomness,
I know, philosophers
for social scientists, including economists and political economists, the word randomness is literally a synonym for exactly what you just described.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just going to use the word randomness because that's the word that I was trained to use, but I'm referring to exactly what you're talking about. Okay. So the proposition that randomness is a necessary condition for free will, both free will and determinism. So that was the proposition that Lisa put on the table. So the relation of this to the structure agency debate briefly is this. There are certain structural responses to randomness, and there are certain agentic responses to randomness. A structural response to randomness is insurance, car insurance, health insurance, life insurance. You know, the fact that adverse events do happen on a regular basis with a probability distribution. And that probability distribution can be analyzed by statisticians and actuarials, and insurance contracts can be created that insure people against random, like floods or health problems or car accidents, etc. So that's a structural response to randomness. It's structural in the sense that it's a set of structural rules that constrain individual behavior. An agentic response to randomness would be, well, one response would be risk aversion. So some people, when they make their individual choices in that space where they do have leeway, they're risk averse. The more risky a strategy is, the less likely they are to take it. They're averse to strategies that have a high probability of large losses. They're willing to pay a price to avoid those options and those strategies. So this is how social scientists think about the relation between randomness, because the world is a random place, and structure and agency. The point is that both structures and agents respond to randomness in certain ways, such that randomness kind of drives a lot of structures and it drives a lot of agents' approaches to the world. So it's absolutely central to explaining why humans behave the way they do, and the balance that gets struck between structure and agency is driven in large part by randomness. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
All right, thanks, Bill. All right. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate both comments from Bill and from Lisa.
Hey, Victor, I got. Do you mind if I got a quick comment?
Go ahead.
When you're so according to the argument presented, if somebody had foreknowledge, then they could act. They would always be able to act accordingly. But according to the argument, we don't have foreknowledge, or it's impossible for us. But okay, so what if you had a super intelligent machine that could approximate foreknowledge that was quite a bit more advanced than us? It sounds like that his argument is partly based on human behavior.
Yeah. No. Well, it would. There is a sharp conceptual difference between foreknowledge, and he means it in the strict sense of epistemic knowledge. This is what it will happen, not probably will happen. Any level of probability is in the realm of is what humans can do. You're right. I mean, the machines could, in theory, be vastly more accurate than humans. They would still be operating, though, under the rules of the laws of nature, which don't allow for, as if he's correct, which don't rule out the possibility of frustrators that could.
Frustrators, yeah.
And as long as the possibility of such things exist in the universe, it precludes foreknowledge in the strict sense of knowledge. Knowledge is what will happen, not what will probably happen. Probability is not a problem here, because we can all make probabilistic predictions and maybe to a greater or lesser extent be accurate about it. But knowledge is a claim about what actually will happen, not probably happen. That maybe that in everyday life we don't deal with such levels of certainty about the future. Perhaps we're totally living in a world of probabilities, and for practical purposes we are. But knowledge is as understood by him, is the part that's threatening to many people about determinism. If you were to tell to somebody, well, I know probably with a high degree of probability what you're going to do tomorrow, and you had lots of good computing firepower to back up your statement, would that be a threat to free will? No, not really. As long as the person said, well, tell me what you predict for me to do tomorrow. But if you reveal that, then you open the door to them frustrating you. Okay, as long as you don't reveal it, then you can continue to live your life as though nothing was known about the future. But I mean, he assumes a sharp distinction between probability and knowledge. And so a super intelligent AI would still be within the realm of probability as far as their ability to predict the future. So I don't know that it would make a difference to his case. In fact, he basically says foreknowledge, because of its claim to absolute truth about the future, is simply inaccessible to us or anything in the universe that we know about. Perhaps if you bring in some supernatural omniscient being, maybe, but we're talking about staying within the laws of a naturalistic worldview. So, and since we're in that system, we can't escape being part of this universe that's governed by natural laws. There's no way we could get beyond probabilities. Maybe we could get to really good probabilities, but not beyond them.
That's what I was thinking. It gets so close to 100, you're 99.999% sure. I guess as long as there's a tiny chance that it won't happen, you don't have certainty, but it's so close to certainty at that point. But
Yeah.
okay, yeah, very interesting. And thanks, Victor.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to present another problem with determinism, and then I'll focus in on the free will problem, which is maybe kind of novel for people. Okay, this, even apart from the fact that from what we've been discussing, that foreknowledge doesn't follow from determinism, that Holton's experiment was about, there's another problem with determinism, and that's this, that assuming, let's take for granted that determinism is true, that it really is, that everything, every event that has ever happened in the universe, it must be of necessity that way because of prior events, assuming that's the case. And now we focus in on human beings, those like us, that want to, the problem is this, could you defend, you could notice determinism, but you could not defend it with an argument. Why? If determinism, even if determinism, I mean, especially if determinism is true, you couldn't defend it. Here's why. Because in a completely deterministic world, there would be no room for normativity. What is normativity? Normativity is conferring value on certain states of affairs or disvalue on them. This, as I've talked before in the past, there are three major realms of normativity. One is aesthetics, the other major one is ethics, and the third one, which people often forget, is logic. Normativity is when you say that something is incorrect or incorrect, right or wrong, good, bad, ugly or beautiful, or logical or not, rational or not. These are judgments placed upon statements or propositions by value conferring entities like ourselves, because we pass judgment on things. We say this is a good argument, this is a bad argument, that's a beautiful painting, this is a beautiful person. These are value judgments. This is expressions of normativity, and the only beings we know of are living beings, also animals too, in some degree express normativity, but dead inanimate objects, as far as we know, don't. And if the world is what would happen if the world was completely deterministic is it would flatten, it would turn everything into description and nothing, no rule, no values, no right or wrong, no valid or invalid, no, because these are normative judgments placed upon statements about the world by beings who care about something. They care about something being incorrect or incorrect, beautiful or ugly, good or bad, so on. These are normative judgments that are only conferred by beings like ourselves. It may include to some degree animals as well, but certainly ourselves. And if determinism would be true, there's no point in judging something good or bad, right or wrong, valid or invalid, if there's nothing to be done about it, which would be the case if determinism was true. So in other words, valid and invalid arguments will be on the same normative level. Good and bad would be evil and beautiful and ugly. Everything would be flattened. No normative concepts would have a place in the universe in a completely universe governed by event causation alone. There wouldn't be these agents who come along and say, well, this is a preferred option over that one, that I think this is right and this is wrong. This kind of value conferring wouldn't happen in a completely deterministic world, because determinism, the assumption of determinism completely rules that possibility out, because nothing matters, literally nothing matters in a deterministic world. Nothing, whether it's valid, invalid, right, wrong, truth, false, beautiful, ugly. Mattering, in other words, is another everyday term for normativity. If something matters to someone or something, there's normativity in the world. In a completely deterministic world, nothing matters to anyone or anything. And the consequence of that is that even thinking about trying to defend determinism or making any kind of argument, either for or against determinism or any other kind of argument, would be ruled out. So that doesn't mean that determinism isn't true. It could be that determinism is true, but it can only be noticed but not rationally defended, because to rationally defend it means you're admitting that there are now beings in the world that can distinguish between valid and invalid. But that's not supposed to happen in a deterministic world, because logical normative claims like that are only meaningful to beings who can envision things being otherwise, who can, and agents, in other words, not dead events that have no interest in one event or another. We have an interest in things, and any living things in general do, but we especially do. We have very sophisticated interest in things, and it governs how we see the world. And that's why the one problem with normativity here, I mean, with determinism, is not that this proves that determinism isn't the case. It just proves that if it is the case, it may as well, it rules out, it can't be defended with a rational argument. It's that simple. Before I go on, go ahead.
I'll defend it with a rational argument.
Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
So the judgments that you're talking about stem from biology. Food is good. Food is beautiful. Poison is bad. Poison is ugly. These are simple biological imperatives that are informed by our evolution and probably extend to pretty much any value judgment that we place on anything. Something that we find attractive is something we want to investigate further. That's how you survive. If you're a thinking human and your main skill is affecting the environment, is bending the environment to your will, something that you find repulsive, ugly, maybe it contains disease, maybe it's dangerous, maybe it's bad for you. I don't see this as a problem with determinism at all. I think it's simple chemical biology at play. It's the encoding that we have to interpret the world, and I think if you agree with subjective ethics and subjective morality, which I do, I don't see it as a problem at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me repeat what I said. I didn't say it's not a problem for the concept of determinism, and it might even be true. I was assuming it's very possible that determinism is true, but my claim was you cannot rationally defend it without inserting normative values into because a rational logical argument is an insistence that this is the correct way to think about it and this is the incorrect way to think about it, similar to judging human behavior. This is good behavior, this is bad, or in aesthetics, this is a beautiful piece of music and it's not so beautiful.
But that's not the argument I made.
Yeah, but all this does is a world in which determinism is true, a hardcore, no exceptions type of determinism. In that world, there is no way to be a determinist consistently and then defend determinism. That doesn't mean that determinism cannot be true, just that you can't defend it because you can't do it without accessing normative resources to do it. And
okay, but I just did.
Eliminated from the scheme.
I just did using, if you dig deep enough, you're not talking about an intellectual process, you're dealing with pure chemistry. Mm-hmm. So I'm not making any value judgments. I'm not making any ethical or moral determinations. I'm simply stating something that if you knew enough about the processes in the human brain, is mm-hmm. just chemistry.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that our normative judgments are the result of biology, or is that what you're suggesting? I agree. Absolutely. Our biology is evolutionarily determined because of we're organisms, we're chemical mixes that interacted with our environment, and here we are behaving the way we do because of that evolutionary history. All that is I can accept, but that basically, and that is a fallout.
Isn't that a defense, though? Isn't that
what you said?
Actually speak?
No, it's not a defense. Because why? Because are you assuming that you're correct in what you just said? If the correctness is a judgment, you don't think
it's no more of a judgment? Again, if you go deep enough, it's no more of a judgment than 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, no, that's a normative claim too, by the way. But what I'm saying is, it's maybe this is hard to imagine, but if determinism was literally, completely, and utterly true, it would simply rob the universal landscape of any kind of value or norm at all. And this would apply across the board to beings like ourselves who do confer value on certain states of affairs, whether it's the rules of thought in the case of logic, the rules of behavior in the case of ethics, and all the other rules about aesthetics, about what we like and don't like, or prefer and don't prefer. And you are right that this only matters to living things that actually have a biology and evolved the way we did. Rocks and stones, we care less whether anything is invalid or beautiful or ugly. They're not part of they don't make rational defenses of anything either. But an argument, I mean, if determinism was true, it basically it turns everything alive out there into, as you said, a bunch of chemicals interacting with each other. And in that realm, there is no right, wrong, valid, invalid. There's no one to make that judgment.
Can't you make a computer do that? That's not a living creature. That's not somebody making a moral.
I think he's got you, Victor.
No, wait a minute. What does the computer tell me? Explain to me how computers have values that they're self-emerging.
You can have the computer make whatever judgment or maintain whatever values you want. You simply have to tell it what to do. But at that point, after you've created this entirely physical object, you have removed yourself from this argument, and now the computer is doing exactly the same thing.
A discussion. We're trying to follow a discussion.
I didn't know whether I was hearing a
But
radio.
somebody's got their mic
Voices in your head, huh?
Yeah.
somebody has.
Oh,
People
yes, very
talking.
good.
Okay. Somebody has their.
I think it's Abby has her mic on.
One here, actually.
Okay, let me.
Victor,
Oh,
Victor,
Okay.
you can mute Abby. You can mute her if you want to.
Okay, I just did. Yeah, Abby, if you're there and you want to be unmuted, let me know. But anyway, a computer. Let's go with that example. A computer is a machine that's told to do something initially by people who have goals in mind, namely us. Does a computer, absent any human input or any kind of external intelligent input, have values? Do they emerge from the machinery itself? Is what you're saying?
No.
Paul, are you suggesting
okay, well, let me put it this way.
No,
Okay.
it doesn't.
Computers are not infinitely complex. Actually, computers are fairly easy to understand, and if we wanted to break it down, we could break down a computer and find every single decision it made, every single logic decision it made. It's not the same as a human brain. It is conceivable that in some universe during some length of time, just by chance, these circuits will exist somewhere in the universe without any input from any biological creature and make exactly these conclusions, these moralistic determinations, these value judgments. I'm just saying that. And then if we went and we looked at this situation, we could prove it was a purely physical calculation that was made. There was no value judgment being made. There was no emotions being applied. It was simply physics as we know it, standard model of physics.
Mm-hmm.
So okay. I don't see the need. I think biology kind of muddies the water here when you're talking about determinism, and you invoke ethics and you invoke judgments. But I think I don't see that as a criticism of determinism if you dig deep enough.
Well, it's actually not a criticism. It's a consequence of it. Is what I'm saying. You're saying it's not a consequence.
Okay. Well, okay. Let me go back to your main assertion: is that you cannot logically defend determinism if you can't logically create an argument that would defend determinism. And I dispute that. I think it can be done, if not by a human being, by a computer, or pretty much by a purely physical function. So I don't understand the argument.
Well, I said earlier about our biological heritage, the fact that we evolved to be the value conferring entities that we are. It doesn't have. I agree with you. There could emerge on other planets a different kind of biology, or as you suggested, a completely mechanistic system that does evolve. The moment this entity, whatever it is, whatever its historical or evolutionary history, however it came to be, The moment it decides it wants to preserve itself, preserve its organizations, it has now become a normative, a value conferring entity. If it doesn't care whether it exists from one moment to moment, then I would agree, it's like a rock. It is not a value conferring entity. But merely to want to preserve your organization for any length of time is the beginning of value conferring. It's the beginning of normativity. That's how I conceive of this. And of course it applies to us, but it in theory could apply to, yes, it could in theory apply to machines. But I don't know of any that exist now or in the future, but it doesn't matter because that's not really the issue. The issue is that if the world really was completely deterministic, then nothing would matter to anything. That's in summary. Okay, because mattering is another term, a synonymous term for conferring value on things, is how I see it. And there are three realms of normativity that that philosophers have identified. One, most people think of ethics, and that's certainly one of them. But the other two are logic and aesthetics. Logic governs the rules that are acceptable of how we think and argue and reason. Ethics is about our interhuman behavior, what's accepted there or not. And aesthetics is the rules, to the extent there are rules, that govern our judgments about everything else in the world. And all I'm saying, my claim is simply this, and maybe you're right. I just don't see how there could be at the same time a defense, because a logical defense, a rational defense, usually implies there are standards of reasoning that if you meet those standards, then you're correct. And who makes this judgment? Some kind of being that really cares about being correct or not. If nothing, stones don't care about their ethics or aesthetics or their logic, but living things do. And potentially computers might, or different beings with different evolutionary histories might.
That's self-memory does.
Anyway, I'm going to pause here. There's a lot of people with their hands up. So
yeah, I've taken too much time.
Who was the next person? There are three hands up. Do you know who it was? Who was first?
I was the first, I guess.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm James. I just apologize for being late. The question is a really interesting one, though, because once you provide the programming to a computer, you could put it on the cloud. You could have as many sensors as you want. So you can have any kind of like number of sensors, perhaps an infinity of sensors or some attempt at that. And you can have, I've had whole walls of small computers working together and with sensors. And you can also have, you could also put it on the cloud and make it open to inputs from all humans. In other words, infinite number of human beings could be available as kind of to the sensory capacity of that computer. In other words, tell me where you work and how you feel about your boss and stuff like that. So yeah, you can definitely create computers that are, as far as inputs are concerned, are very wide. But that's really pretty much the issue. You have programming, you have inputs, and that's your selection process in designing a computer system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, who was had next with their hand up?
That would be Bill.
Bill, go ahead, Bill.
Great. I want to sidestep Paul and James's points that they were making and just go straight to your point, Victor, your original point about this argument against determinism and the proposition, which you summarized clearly, the proposition that if determinism is true, if we live in a completely deterministic universe, then there is zero scope whatsoever, ever, for normativity, period. That's the proposition. So where normativity is defined as you defined it, Victor. So I want to take that to its logical conclusions and reach a particular conclusion and then put that conclusion on the table, which seems to me to follow logically from that proposition, and see what that conclusion looks like. So if this proposition, this if-then statement, is true, then it would seem to imply logically the following about the case of physical scientists, not biological scientists, but physical scientists in chemistry and physics and, you know, optics and hydrology, you know, etc. When they do their work, if this proposition is true, then it would seem to imply that when those kinds of scientists do their work, then they are literally incapable of distinguishing between valid causal hypotheses and invalid causal hypotheses with respect to a particular causal hypothesis in their field that they're examining, like you know, how waves work or how optics work or how chemical reactions work. If normativity were completely impossible and there's no scope for it, they would not be able to distinguish between valid and invalid hypotheses. That seems to me to be a logical implication of the proposition that you summarized, Victor. So now that that implication is on the table, how does that look to all of us?
Well, let me respond immediately. I actually do respond to that in the extended write-up, and that's this. In philosophy of science, you don't need to make any metaphysical assumptions about determinism. Science can operate perfectly well with the understanding there is no determinism. It's all that matters to the scientists. There was a whole philosophy of science of the early 20th century which was agnostic about the world outside the data. We studied data, they said. We look for patterns. We then extract from that data and those patterns information that's useful to some human purpose. That's it. I don't need to speculate about what's going on behind all that. It's enough that it works for my purposes, for human ends. There is a philosophy of science that takes that view. In early 20th century, that was a very prominent view. At the moment, there are these views about how to do philosophy of science do alter. There's a fashion. They come and go. And at the moment, we are perhaps in a more hardcore, realistic external. There is a real external world out there as opposed to idealism. But these trends have rotated historically. But the important point here is that you can still do science exactly the way it is being done without having any opinion about determinism or there being a real world outside of what your data and the information you're able to glean about that world.
I think, Victor, that is true, but it's a secondary point. I think the primary point arising from all I said is this. Number one, we do observe that scientists and the physical scientists are able to distinguish between valid and invalid causal hypotheses. Mm-hmm. And that's a fact of the history of science.
It's true.
What that implies for the proposition that a fully deterministic universe eliminates the scope for normativity, what it implies for that proposition is one of two things. Either that proposition is wrong, that a fully deterministic universe does not imply no scope for normativity, because physical scientists do have the ability to distinguish between valid and invalid hypotheses, or it implies that we don't live in a fully deterministic world, so that the if part of the proposition is wrong. It either implies that the then part of the proposition is wrong or the if part of the proposition is wrong. They can't both be right when we observe scientists distinguishing between valid and invalid causal hypotheses. This is my conclusion from the evidence that scientists do make scientific progress.
And you don't even have to go to physics. You can go to ethics. More people have been distinguishing moral arguments all the time for ages, and we do it in aesthetics. It's nothing here. The point is that determinism, whether determinism is true or not, is irrelevant to any human concern. That is my bottom line. It might be true, it might be false. Either way, it doesn't affect how science works or how day-to-day moral judgments or aesthetic judgments work. It's irrelevant. That's the claim. Not that it's false, irrelevant. That's my eventual point. Anyway. Go ahead, Lisa, you have your hand up? You can respond later, Bill, to what I said.
Gosh, so much went on between realism is, regardless of any wish, whim, or will of anybody, it's an objective truth in which scientists are merely observers. So I agree with you in those terms. Logic is true whether we believe it or not. It shows us. I'll just use the three concepts of logic of the excluded middle, a contradiction, and what's the third one? And those things don't change. They are true regardless of whether we want to believe in a subjective ideal or not. And so when we talk about where normative comes in, and I do agree with you, it does include aesthetics, ethics, and logic. When those come into play, it's an observation and meaning we give to realism so that we can have an understanding of what's going on. But the physicists don't give meaning to things. They just make measurements and observe. That is their job. And so when we come up with something like quantum mechanics where we can't measure it anymore, when we have a problem with it and it disappears on us and it's got this spookiness to it, then we go back and have to go, well, who's the observer here? And what is this observer doing? And how is this happening that we can't talk about it and make any measurements in any type of formula, the way they use it in a formula? So in a way, we're talking about two different things. It's almost an equivocation because realism is going to be there, but how we put meaning to that is the way we observe that and perceive what it is that we're looking at. So by putting those together, to me, seem a kind of equivocation in the sense that we need to dissect those a little bit out a bit. And the reason I say that, because in a normal person's life, the way we deal with the universe is through habit. We create habits for ourselves. Do they work? Do they not work? But those habits have to be based in reality for them to have real meaning. Otherwise, you're just spinning in your head of subjectivity or solipsism. So when we talk about those things about observation or perception, you need to make sure that you're not mixing the two as if they were the same. It's almost an a priori, a posteriori problem. And that's why I think talking about it in those terms as a complete determinism, again, I think is a contradiction because it requires chance. It has to. Otherwise, we can't move. We can't even talk about this. Is it what I wanted to ask you about, do you think that this might be like an infinite regress kind of thing? Have you ever gone into it that way about determinism? The way the Greeks talked about infinite regress of where things start from cause and effect. Maybe there's a problem there too. What started all the cause and effect? We just go back. So it's kind of like maybe the question of absolute determinism is really false, I think. That's just my opinion, though.
Yeah, well,
what do you think about that?
Thanks, Lisa. I don't have. Yeah, I mean, the infinite regress problem with I don't have an opinion about that. To me, an infinite regress is barely conceivable, but also the opposite of an infinite regress, a beginning, is barely conceivable to me too. I find myself completely agnostic as to which of those two possibilities. I mean, it's like when someone tried to convince me that there's a God, for example. It's not that I'm a knee-jerk atheist. I'm not, but I do find it hard to imagine if God were to appear in person in front of me, what would be my reaction? And my first reaction would be that I'm hallucinating. Is not because I don't believe there's a God, but because I don't have anything to connect with something that supernatural. My entire life has been in the natural world. I just don't know what to say about that. And to the extent that determinism is a metaphysical thesis about things, an infinite chain is also like that to me. It's like, I don't know what to say about whether it was infinite regress or whether it was at a beginning. And my tendency, as I said earlier, is not to argue against determinism, but merely to say that I don't know what to say about it, and it seems to be highly irrelevant to most human, even to science. It's irrelevant to the practice of science, whether or not determinism is true. Many scientists can easily restrict their understanding of what they're doing to studying what's in front of me. What can I gather from that could be of interest or use to me or to humankind? But what's beyond what I can actually observe and can only speculate about, I think if they want to be intellectually respectable or responsible, they have to be agnostics about that. There's nothing.
Well, they do carry a kind of an assumption that if there's an effect, there had to be a cause, kind of feel many times, and I don't know if that's a fallacy or not, but
okay. Well, I do mention an extended write-up. There's a famous argument by David Hume about causation, about he brings things back to our psychology. He thinks the whole idea of cause and effect is a part of our psychology. It's one way we organize experience. That's it. It's just because our psychology is a certain way doesn't say anything about how the world is that way. Our psychology evolved the way it did because it was useful for our survival. It's an extension of our biology. But where is the necessity that our psychology should map on accurately to the physical world, independent of our biology and psychology? That's what we have no way of escaping. We are judgmental creatures. We do, when we observe patterns repeating themselves over and over again, we can't help but say that event B that is constantly following event A, we want to call event B an effect and event A a cause. We see this happen often enough. We can't avoid it. It's in our psychology. The same thing is true with free will, by the way. But we'll get to that in a moment if we get that far today. But that's my view is not reducing everything to psychology, but because I don't know what's beyond the psychology. I'm just saying I'm trying to be as minimalistic, as frugal as possible in my metaphysics here. I don't know about determinism of free will in some sense that is not human-centered or animal-centered, even. And I know about that value-conferring entities, such as human beings, as well as animals, and perhaps even artificial ones in the future, organize their world in a certain way that is in some way connected with preserving their organization, staying alive, surviving, either individually or collectively. And that's about as far as I can go with the speculation about what's behind all that. I don't know. It's not that I'm not really arguing against determinism. I'm just saying that whatever the truth is about it, it seems highly irrelevant to any human concern.
I agree with that. It's such an old argument. I mean, 4,000 years, they were still doing that. I mean, really? I don't know. There's some new stuff out there.
Yeah, the only way it could be relevant, and I talk about this in the extended write-up, would be this. If it turns out that assuming that determinism is true helps like grease our inferences to make progress in learning new things about the natural world, which are helpful to us. If it's necessary for us to believe in determinism to accomplish things, that could be a pragmatic reason for whether or not determinism is true, it's in our best interest to believe it is true. And in fact, that's exactly where we're going to go in my last part of this argument, because Strawson, as I mentioned at the very beginning, who's a hardcore determinist, and refers to, I think, Saul Selinsky or something, an Israeli philosopher who wrote an interesting paper a number of years ago, in which he's a determinist, but he argues in defense of what he calls a necessary illusion. It's an illusion because he is a determinist, but it's not dispensable. And the necessary illusion he has in mind is free will. He says, given how we're positioned in the universe, we must, in order to function as human beings, behave as though we had free will, whether or not we actually have, in some metaphysical sense, free will. It's a requirement of our survival that we at least behave as though we did have free will. So he calls free will a necessary illusion. And I would argue that determinism is exactly the same thing. It may be for some people that it really greases your ability to think clearly and accomplish things. For example, if a scientist really needs to believe that what they're doing relates to the world independent of any human interest, if that helps them make some progress, by all means, believe it. But it's an illusion to the extent you cannot determine whether it's true or false. But it may be necessary, a heuristic, a device to help you accomplish something. And free will may serve that very same function, according to Selinsky. So my bottom line here is that both determinism and free will are necessary illusions. And whether they're anything beyond an illusion, that's an open question. By illusion, I don't mean that I know it to be false, only that it's something. In fact, at the end of the paper, I just say it's just necessary. Drop the illusion part. It's just necessary. It may be true or false, but it's necessary for us to function. And it could be the status of determinism is just like that of free will, in the sense that it's necessary for us to function in the world. But beyond that, I don't know. I have no view. Anyway, before I go on to the last part of the thing, I want to talk, because we're talking about determinism so far, but I want to talk about a serious problem with free will that, in my view, makes it, not that it doesn't prove that we don't have free will, it just says that that our understanding of it is very enigmatic. I mean, it's almost incoherent, but it doesn't take away from perhaps its utility. But I guess I'll go ahead and talk about that last part right now. And this does involve Kant. So I know some of you aren't very, it has to do with this. For free will to be what's the right word? Meaningful, certainly someone who is claiming that they're engaging in an act of free will, that they're doing something out of their own free will, surely they must know something about their own motive for why they are doing it. In other words, I'm assuming, at least, that for an act of free will to occur, there has to be an element of transparency of motive. You, the person claiming to act freely, must know why you are doing it. If you don't know, that doesn't seem compatible with acting freely. If you're acting in a fog, then you can't possibly be, in my view, acting freely. So it seems that an act of free will requires what I call motivational transparency at the time of the act. If you don't know what it is, then it is not an act of free will. So then, is motivational transparency possible? And here I argue it's not. We can guess. What does happen is something I talked about in a previous meetup. We rationalize a lot. We act, and then we come back after the fact and say, well, I did this for this and that reason. But rationalization is an ex post facto act. It's an act that you do after to justify to someone, even if it's just to yourself, why you did something. The reason you give for why you did something may not actually be the real reason you did it. The real reason you did it, in order to be an act of free will, has to be transparent. So what kinds of motives can be transparent? And I argue in the paper that none. Let's go down the list. And actually, this is where Kant comes in. Kant was very exercised about his understanding of what makes a moral act. He was concerned with his notion that a truly moral act, according to Kant, was done out of respect for the moral law. The moral law is a very abstract concept, but the respect part is actually a feeling. It's not enough to do what the moral law does. You have to do it for the right reason. You have to be motivated out of respect. And respect is a feeling that you either have or don't. You can do the perfectly right thing, according to Kant, and still not be moral because your motivation wasn't right. The motivation has to be this concept of respect. Now, I'm not going to be defending Kant here on that. That's another story. But he did, in the process of trying to explain what he meant by respect for an abstract concept, he went down the list of all the large classes of things that motivate people to do things. First one is one that, Lisa, you mentioned earlier, habit. In his view, if you act from habit, you are not acting morally. Even if you're doing wonderful things because it's second nature. An animal can do that. And he thought that only humans can be moral. An animal is amoral, not evil, but just not in the realm of moral judgment. So doing things because you trained yourself to do it or because you're absent-minded is not a legitimate motive for being a moral act. Second, acting out of consequence, for fear of consequences or self-interest is not a moral motive. People obey the laws all the time without necessarily believing in the laws. For Kant, they would have to have respect for the law because they think that law is correct, not just because I'm afraid of what might happen to me if I break it. That's not a moral reason. So consequences, fear or desire consequences are certain consequences that are desirable. If those things are motivating you, those are not legitimate motives from his perspective. Neither has happened, of course. And then the final and fourth one is, in the case of morality, the selflessness or feelings of benevolence, like the British moral sense theorists like David Hume and Adam Smith, who felt that basically morality is about having the right feelings of people who are genuinely empathetic. That's a moral act. According to Kant, no, empathy and sympathy are not proper moral motives because they are, some people have them and some people don't. And that would be, you couldn't judge people then whether they acted bad in a bad way or a good way, if in fact their behavior was completely dependent on the happenstance of their being highly empathetic people or psychopaths. So then when you rule out all these motives that were as legitimate moral motives, what's left? And this is where it gets really interesting. Even Kant himself said maybe nothing is left because almost 99.99% of everything human beings ever do is captured by one of these motives, which I just mentioned. They're either acting because they're afraid of something or because they desire something or out of mindlessly habit or because of feelings of concern or sympathy or benevolence to other people. If you rule all those out, what is left is, and even Kant himself admits this in one place, maybe nothing. In one place, he makes a very remarkable statement. He says, perhaps not once in the entire history of the human race has a single moral act ever occurred. Now, that's a pretty bleak statement. But it's because of the super high standards he placed on what it takes to be a moral. There are skyscraping standards which perhaps no one ever meets. So you might ask, well, what kind of moral theory is that rules out the possibility of there being a moral act? Well, the best I can say in defense of Kant is that it's that he deliberately made it hard because anytime we begin to think that we might be acting morally, we're in danger of resting on our laurels. He wants to keep us guessing he wants us to constantly suspect ourselves all the time of acting immorally. We're never supposed to rest content with anything you've done, that was a good thing. Because that immediately leads to complacency. And his moral theory was very, very tyrannical and perhaps impractical. But okay, well, how does this relate to free will? Again, earlier I said, in order to act freely, it seems incoherent to say, I don't know why I acted, but I acted freely. So then if you do act freely, then you must be able to say, what is your motivation at the time you acted? And if it turns out there's what I call a lot of motivational opacity, our own motives at any given moment in life are not clear to us. And the more you look into them, the more unclear they become because of the impossibility for us ever to know what our genuine motive was at any given moment. That makes an act of free will highly suspect. It doesn't make it impossible, but it does make it hard to imagine. You have to have complete self-transparency to be able to say you acted freely. And since that is such a challenge, such a difficult thing to conceive of, it may well make an act of free will, if not impossible, psychologically or epistemically, I should say, impossible, not metaphysically impossible, but epistemically impossible to know that you had acted freely. That's what's difficult. Not that you might act freely, but that for you to know that you acted freely. So what this does is it makes an act of free will, perhaps all acts of free will, suspect. Who are you going to ask besides yourself about whether or not you acted freely? You can't judge, you can't poll other people. They're objective parties. It's your own interest. The unreliability of our ability to introspect accurately is what prevents us from ever knowing whether we acted freely or not. And if that's the case, then it makes free will highly suspect. Doesn't rule it out, doesn't say it's impossible, it just says, when can you say for sure that you acted freely? It leaves open the door to all kinds of other unconscious and other things happening that could have influenced your decision. Now, after the fact, after you've acted, people often do say, I did so and so for such and such a reason. But that's something we talked about last time, about how difficult it is to distinguish rationalization from actual reasons that motivated you. And it's actually quite hard to do, as we talked about last time, when we talked about how moral philosophers are more likely to steal ethics books from philosophy libraries than non-moral philosophers, and they give excellent reasons for why they were justified in, snitching that book, and the reasons might even make sense, but it's got to be suspicious that here these experts in moral philosophy are coming up with reasons which on the surface seem very dubious. And if that's the case with these experts, how much more so is it the case with more normal, ordinary people going about justifying their behavior? So anyway, I'll pause right now and see what anybody have any reactions to this. Or anybody? Go ahead, Bill.
It raises the question of how free will could be measured if it were actually existing in the world. You've discussed one, at least hypothetical, way to measure it, which is the exerciser of free will either being able to know or not being able to know that they exercise free will. One can imagine other ways to measure the exercise of free will or the non-exercise of free will, such as other people measuring whether an individual exercised free will or didn't exercise free will. So it seems to me maybe the person themselves measuring it might be impossible, but still others might be able to measure it. Or the opposite could be the case, that others can't measure it, but the person themselves can measure it. Or maybe neither can measure it, or maybe both can measure it. I don't know what the measurement methodology would be. I just wanted to put the question on the table. What's the measurement methodology to resolve the debate about whether a person actually has free will or not? Okay,
great. That's a great question, Bill, and I addressed it right up. You're right. The problem is with knowing whether in a specific case whether an individual acted freely or not is a problem both for the individual and for third parties. For third parties, the problem is different, okay. Earlier, I did mention at the very beginning, I talked about one reinterpretation of what free will, which I find maybe you accept this, but one interpretation of free will is that you are acting freely when there's no obvious thing that's influencing you, pulling your strings. No one's putting a gun to your head, no one's forcing your arm, no one's bribing you or threatening you. And if all those situations have been ruled out, then you're acting freely. That's one understanding of free will. And I can see the appeal of it because it makes it objectively observable whether or not you're acting freely, because third parties can observe you. If they don't see any of these factors involved, they can say you're acting freely. What's wrong with that understanding of free will is that it's perfectly compatible with determinism. Just because you aren't, no one's putting a gun to your head, but you're doing something because of some long history of something deep in your past history which conditioned you to be able to make that decision then, but is not observable by other parties. That's still determined. It's still deterministic. So that, in other words, that's a very, I call that free will light, a very shallow version of free will, in which all it takes to act freely is that no objective party can see any reason why you aren't acting freely. It looks to them like you're acting freely, therefore you are. So what's wrong with that understanding is, well, it's perfectly compatible with determinism, and it may be the only practical understanding of what free will is. But what I'm suggesting is going further, that not even the party involved themselves, regarding their own motives, which aren't obvious to third parties, not even they are in a position to know whether they acted freely. Now, if both parties are ruled out, this is why we have a problem, because if neither objective third parties nor you yourself have any idea whether you're acting freely, what does that say about being able to act freely? It doesn't say it's impossible, it just says it's not accessible to anyone. The information about whether you acted freely is not accessible to anyone. And if it's not accessible to anyone, it raises some questions about whether it's real or not. You know, so Zaid and then Lisa, I believe you have your hands up. Thanks, Bill.
Hello. My name is Zaid, and thank you for the talk. So I want to ask you if we agree that there's no free will, and perhaps it looks that way, but doesn't our question that we ask ourselves, that is there free will, doesn't that say that we actually do? I mean, if we don't have free will, why are we asking this question? Because it seems to me like it might be, disadvantageous if it's like AI. At what point will AI ask itself, am I real? And if not, why and what happened?
Is that it? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not actually saying that we don't have free will. I don't know whether we have free will. Same thing about determinism. I don't know if determinism is true. All I was trying to point out in this topic is that both of them have problems, conceptual problems. To sum it up, with determinism, it has two problems that I see. One is that it may be that what people are afraid of with determinism is not determinism itself, but the possibility that foreknowledge derives from determinism. And as we talked about earlier, I don't know if you heard this earlier in the discussion, we talked about the distinction between foreknowledge and determinism, and how one does not follow from the other. Determinism might be true, but foreknowledge might be impossible. And if foreknowledge is impossible, then it leaves wide open the idea that it could be the threat of foreknowledge is what people find scary about determinism. So that distinction, which we talked about earlier, kind of defangs or takes away the threat of free will. It doesn't show it's wrong. It just simply says it's not relevant to our lives because it's about something that we don't have access to. It's independent of, it's a metaphysical question versus an epistemological question, which was what foreknowledge is about, epistemology, about what we can know. And that's one problem with determinism. The other one, which is the more sophisticated one that Paul radically disagreed with me about, is that as I see it, if determinism is true, it robs if it's in the strictest sense true, it flattens all statements about any part of the universe into descriptive statements, so that as opposed to prescriptive statements or normative statements, nothing matters. In other words, things just, it's one damn thing after another forever and ever. And that's it. To pass judgments about this damn thing being a better thing than that one, that's a local problem we have as humans, but we're not talking about the universe. We're talking about our psychologies and our individual prehistory or whatever. But it's not a question about the world. It's the limitation that we have. And then the problem with free will is not that, again, I know that if we have it or we don't have it, it's that it seems to be part of the concept of acting freely is that you must know what it is that's motivating you. And if that turns out to be extremely difficult to do, perhaps impossible, that makes free will kind of a will-o'-the-wisp. It's not that it's not true, it's just that it seems the knowledge that you acted freely is inaccessible, both to third parties because they aren't you, and to you yourself because of our complex and evolutionarily developed psychologies, which tend to prioritize other motives like habit, like self-interest, like fear of consequences, like genuine feelings of concern for other people. But those are all motives that animals have, and we don't give animals free will. So it doesn't rule out the possibility that we're capable of having motives that are above and beyond all of those. But it does make it problematic to think about that, and that was what I was trying to say. Bill and okay, there are 4 hands up. Does anybody know who was the next person who had their hands up?
I think
I'm
it was
not
me.
next.
Lisa?
I'm not next. Someone else is next.
It was me.
Okay, Lisa, go ahead. And then Daniel.
I was thinking about the idea of determinism that you said that it would be bland and stale. I've heard it said that by free will, if we had no free will, that it would just be an all-out immoral position. And I think it was St. Augustine who said it, that without having free will, then we just do things that we wanted and desired them and take control of that morally in ethics. But my question, and maybe you can help me with this, is, and I know it might be very narrow, but that's how philosophy gets. But if I'm ashamed of something, could I, by effort of my will, have resisted the temptation and done something otherwise? What is that? Because by assertion and logic, every assertion you make is true, even if it's false. So where is the effort of my will to prevent me from doing something in temptation and desire? Where does that lie? That's always been my question about free will.
Are you saying that you mean like a psychological effort to?
It's even deeper than that. Can I lie to myself even? Really?
Knowingly, willfully?
Willfully,
Yeah.
and through effort of my will, stop that and do something else is really the question.
All right.
What do you think of that one?
Well, the determinists would say that if you successfully, let's say you're trying to quit smoking or something, but you're really addicted, but you really genuinely want to stop, and you, through some supreme effort, manage to do it. A determinist will say, well, it was always in the cards that you were going to succeed, and other people were not going to succeed. But for you, past events lined up in just the right way that you would succeed, and even that, that's what the determinists would say.
That's a form of fate, almost.
Yeah.
It's a weird connection right there. I don't know.
I have talked in the past. That's a different topic. There is something called logical fatalism, which is different from determinism, which I find very interesting.
Me too.
But it's not about the natural world. It's about pure understanding of laws of logic and what they would require.
So what's the effort of our will?
What I mean, like,
can I change something when I have temptation in front of me? Can the effort of my will, can I change it?
If you're asking, does it happen in the world? I would say yes. It definitely happens that people try really hard to change something that's very hard for them to change through what they perceive as supreme effort, and they succeed, and sometimes they don't.
Is that free will?
Well, the phenomena of that happening is real, but the free will thing is what explains it. The determinists would say the explanation is to do with some past events. Some people may have had developed over a long period of time stronger resistance to temptations and other drives than other people have. But the causes of those are part of the natural world. You didn't invent those causes. The free will agent, the free will view would say that, well, I think they would say that it's possible that against all odds, against all the forces of nature that were trying to hold you back from changing, you somehow triumph through like some kind of power that you broke out of the causal chain somehow. That's the, I think, one view of what free will is. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, it's possible, but I don't know that. That's a strong assertion of free will right there. It says there,
well,
it's possible.
You know what, I think about this in these terms because when you're studying religion philosophically, not in a spiritual way, but philosophically, if you were to ask the question, why didn't God just make us all angels? We'd have no suffering. We could live forever. Life would be grand. We wouldn't be here talking about free will and determinism. And it occurred to me, it's kind of like if my husband, if I were married, were to say, I love my wife. My wife's great. I love her. But there's a difference between saying, I love my wife and I cherish the ground my wife walks on. There's a big difference between one being what you're supposed to be doing and the other one from your will. And which one of those has more power seems to be the one that you dig deep for, in a way. Okay. And so in a way, that's why we're not all angels, is because supposedly God wants us to use our free will to love him freely. And it's kind of that same thing. I want my husband to love me freely, not because he's supposed to do it. Right. See, so the determinism is there, but the free will goes just a little bit deeper down into the soul sort of thing. The effort of the will comes to power. Now, right. Can it change? And otherwise, something to make something else. Is that determined? I don't know. So it goes back and forth and back and forth. I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a topic I might do in the future, because it's a long-standing topic, and that's the difference between the value we placed on in fact, I think I mentioned it recently about when we talked about a couple of meetups ago, when I talked about whether someone really has certain feelings for you as opposed to behaving as though they had the feelings. It's like the difference between, I once made a distinction between being honest and being sincere, right? And it's a slightly technical difference. Honesty is something where your words, assuming it's about words, match up with what any objective third party could say. You behave honestly, you tell the truth, you never say anything that a third party could possibly say you lied. But that's not the same thing as being sincere. Sincere is like where it's not about what is publicly observable, about something going on inside the person. Are they whole, authentic, and real, and connected with this belief or whatever it is? And it could even exist in the presence of objective dishonesty. One could be sincere but dishonest at the same time, because dishonesty is something that's judged by third parties, or honesty is judged by third parties. And sincerity is something that only that person can really look into themselves and say, I really feel this, or I really don't. And yeah, that, anyway.
That's really interesting. That is an interesting point.
Okay, but I don't want to go too far there, because that's an interesting topic on its own. I call it, it's about the limits of self-understanding, but anyway. Daniel, I think you were next on the list.
This is a great discussion, great questions, but I'm not sure that we're not oversimplifying or overcomplicating. I have so many thoughts, but I guess the basic issue that I have with your discussion is that free will, you say, implies a transparency of motive. And to me, that's probably the most difficult concept you've presented, because I don't think we can ascribe one motive to one behavior, no matter what I do. Okay, why are you giving this lecture? Could be your ego, it could be your genuine wish to teach people, you like to interact, you're lonely. I can give a million reasons as to why you're giving this talk. So what am I going to focus on? Which motive? I don't know. It could be in multiple motives. So transparency doesn't address free will one way or the other, because no matter what you can describe, why am I eating? I'm eating because I'm hungry, or I like food, or I want to live. You know, again, what am I going to focus on as a motive? And usually we function on so many different levels that to ascribe one motive is an oversimplification. Now, there could be overriding. You could spend more of your time to develop your ego, and you want to have a great reputation. And somebody else might say, that doesn't matter to me. I just want to make money. So again, many motives, and even that, you might want a reputation, and at the same time make money as well. So you want to break it down into percentages. It's very hard to have a transparency of motive, because motives, no matter what explanation you give to my behavior, inevitably I find, hey, there's some element of truth to it. There's some level at which it addresses.
Right.
So that's really with your thesis, that's really the basic issue of this one point of transparency.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. You're exactly right, and that's what I was pointing to. And this is what makes problematic the idea that there exists a pure act of free will, because now you could break the connection and say it's possible to, someone might say, I'm not saying this because I'm not sure I understand it, but someone might say you can act freely without knowing a thing about your motives. I find that hard to believe. It seems to me that it's implied that if you're acting freely, that you do know something about why you're acting. If you don't, then what does it mean to act freely? That you don't know why you're acting.
But that's an issue. That's an issue of mindfulness. Okay, and what are you mindful of? And at one point, you can do things mechanically or by habit, but still, in the final analysis, break down every one of these motives. Is this motive genuine? Is this authentic? Is that real? Is that the real you? Each aspect that you're going to focus on, you're going to have to ultimately question: is that aspect freely or not? Or there other? So it's an endless loop.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm using that, I agree absolutely with what you're saying, and I'm using that to throw a suspicious light on the possibility of free act of will, because I can't imagine how you could act freely and not have some transparency of motive. And what you're saying is it's not possible to have one, and I agree, which throws the possibility of acting freely. It's a problem for it. This is what I call the big problem with, but it's not a problem that makes it impossible. It doesn't say that, oh, we don't have free will. That's not the conclusion. The conclusion is we may never have once in our lives been absolutely sure we were acting freely. And if we don't have because we don't have the knowledge of this transparency of motive. If that's the case, and it seems possible, if not likely that that's the case, that means, going back to Kant's statement when he said it's possible that in the whole history of the human race, not one single act has ever been a moral act, because of the requirements he required for transparency of motive. And it was only one motive that counted. All the others were animals have those motives. So I agree with your statement. In fact, I was trying to say the same thing. And but maybe you don't agree with my conclusion. My conclusion is that the fact of our lack, what I call motivational opacity, the opposite of transparency, argues against the of the actuality of an act of free will. Not that it's impossible, but that it's hard to determine for any one given individual whether they're acting freely ever. Okay, that's my conclusion. I don't know. James.
I won't dispute that.
Okay, James.
Yeah, no, I really. No, finish your thought, Victor.
No. I was just going to. No. Go ahead, James, and then Bill.
Okay, so I was just going to say that I really like what Daniel had to say. It kind of I think psychologically it kind of matches my feelings, but on the other hand, the question I ask is like, what does freedom and have to do with force? I think this is something that comes up in science all the time. We're kind of constantly measuring force. Either if there's no force, there's no force. If we're beyond the heliopause, it might not be really relevant to be measuring gravity. In other words, there are things that can be measured, and there are things that we don't really have any force to have to deal with. And this can be true of the human mind as well. There could be forces in the human mind that we want to discuss and we want to measure, and we want to talk about them. But that doesn't mean there's infinite force available at all times, just like there's not infinite force available in a star system or infinite force available at all times between heliopauses or between galaxies or whatever. So we want to kind of this is what quantum mechanics encountered. They encountered the argument back on them that if we take your formulas seriously, we're not going to be able to predict the existence of atoms and mass consistently. We're not going to be able to deal with this. So you had this kind of feedback, and it was only solved, by the I think it was ultimately solved by the uncertainty principle, that you're not going to be able to predict in every case, predict the absolute amount of force that exists in an atomic system. And I think the mind is the same. We have force. There's probably forces in the mind that we can talk about, but they're not all pre-fed. The influences on human beings and other animals is not all kind of like from birth to death set on a programmatic course, but we see all these accidents happen. We even predict things that are almost impossible, like that all the bees are going to die next year and stuff like that. We have ridiculous mind games that people play with themselves that are called science. So, I just I think science provides a lot of information for us about things in the universe that are measurable, but when they're not measured, then we either assume that they exist we assume that they exist in a condition of freedom. And that's how engineers think, that things have a certain freedom, and the freedom occurs when things are not limited by forces. When the movement of a motor is not conditioned by gravity, then the motor is running freely in a circular motion. So so I think the mind is the same. And all these arguments about what would happen morally if this and that, no, I don't think they count as much. But
are you saying,
yeah.
James, that if we someday learn completely or how exactly the brain works, how every neuron in there does, that we know what causes, for example, us to have a random memory at a certain time of our lives, and we could trace back, we have a complete physical understanding of the brain, that then there will be no mystery about our behavior anymore. That free will will disappear. Is that what you're saying? Because you're saying that knowledge preempts free will. As long as we have knowledge, we don't. In other words, free will fills the spaces that knowledge still leaves vacant.
I'm certainly not saying that at all. I'm saying that if I have a concern about philosophy, or if I have a concern about science, then I have no concern at all about my ability to think freely.
Okay.
And because I've been doing it for all these years, and
Right.
more and more as I get older, I'm freer and freer in my thinking. I can't help it. It's like it's kind of like well, what is going to, I mean, what is going to stop me? Well, physical force can stop me. And that's when we talk about, with people who talk about determinism, they're obviously talking about some idea of physical force in the universe. And I acknowledge that that exists, but I don't acknowledge that it controls every measurable force doesn't control everything in the universe. There are even anomalies where things can never be measured, as we know, in atomic science. So what is this kind of like concern about I don't understand the concern about the human mind being stuck in some pattern that in the future will be measurable, that will somehow matter. No, I don't believe in that at all. I think it's kind of like it's science fiction, and you could maybe write a great novel about people having no influence on their own lives. I think Aldous Huxley did that. The Point Counterpoint, he wrote a novel about people being forced because of sexual habit into a calendar-based existence. So yeah, you could restrict people's thinking using force, but it involves an awful lot of pre-planning. And fascism is kind of that kind of concept. You could pre-plan people's existence, no question.
Okay, go ahead, Bill.
I want to pick up on a question that was put on the table by someone maybe 10, 15 minutes ago. It might have been Lisa. Take the case of a person who has a habit that's not serving them well anymore, and they realize that. Maybe the person's eating too many chocolate chip cookies, or watching too much Netflix, or smoking too many cigarettes, and whatever the habit might be, and they want to change it, and the question is, do they have free will to change it, or are they just going to be smoking too many cigarettes forever, or eating too many chocolate chip cookies forever, whatever? And there's variation. There's people who face such a problem who are able to change their habits, and others who are not. So it does raise a question from like a social science perspective. What explains the difference? Is it between the people who are able to change the habit and those who are not? So one angle on this is let me put some examples on the table. The idea that one's desires that one acts on, to smoke cigarettes or eat chocolate chip cookies, the idea that one's desires can be changed over time at a cognitive level, at the level of neuronal structure, but not instantaneously, not simply through saying, I'm not going to eat so many chocolate chip cookies, but rather through engaging in a process over time. And there's a few examples of what that process looks like, depending on which process you choose to engage in, or the habit the chocolate chip cookie eater chooses to engage in. For example, one would be, a Buddhist meditation teacher would say to that person, okay, you've got a Buddha nature deep down inside you that you can get in touch with if you meditate for 10 years. And after 10 years of meditating, you'll get in touch with that Buddha nature, and you won't eat so many chocolate chip cookies anymore. You won't smoke so many chocolate chip cookies. I mean, you won't eat so many chocolate chip cookies anymore, because you'll get beyond your momentary desires to a deeper level of your being, the ground of being that is innate within you, that can be kind of brought up to the surface and become the new you if you just meditate long enough. Now, someone in the Stoic tradition might say a similar thing. If you practice the principles of Stoicism, and I'm choosing non-deistic spiritual paths for a reason, to leave God out of it. And let's leave the God language out of it, because there are non-deistic spiritual paths like Buddhism, like Stoicism. So the Stoic teacher would say, hey, if you study with us and join our Stoic study group and read these texts and practice these principles in your daily life, then by a year or 2 or 5 years from now, you won't eat so many chocolate chip cookies. You won't, smoke so many cigarettes. Or an existentialist might say, join our existential study group. Or a humanist might say, join our humanist study group. Learn these texts, practice these principles. Over time, it will change. The underlying assumption in all these cases, as well as in the religious cases, of these religious processes, in both the deistic and non-deistic processes, the underlying assumption is that there's a deeper level of a human being that can be actualized, and once actualized over time through a process like this, changes what a person desires on a moment-to-moment basis, so that they no longer even desire the chocolate chip cookies. And so then from this perspective, the question is, Does a person have free will to choose to join a Stoic group? Or are the people who join the Stoic groups, or the existentialist groups, the people who are pre-wired at birth by genetics to have a proclivity to join such a group? It's kind of like the infinite regress, of, well, what caused the desire to have the desire to join the Stoic group? What caused the desire to have the desire to have the desire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll close with this. The reason I'm putting these notions on the table is because human history is filled with people who have changed how their own desires work, but it took time and they had to follow a path, deistic path, non-deistic path, whatever. So the apparent conclusion from this is that humans do have free will to change what they desire, but it's not easy and it takes time, and there's like rules to it, whether it's the Stoics rules or the Buddhist rules or some religion's rules, whatever. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thanks. Go ahead. See, anybody else have their hands up? I thought
I'm just wondering. I mean, to follow up on Bill, go back to the first time that you smoked a cigarette, the first time you tried cocaine or whatever it is that you're addicted to nowadays, and were you free at that time? So you made a choice. Was that a free choice or not? Well, you can argue, well, I was overwhelmed by wanting to be accepted as part of the group, so I smoked a cigarette to conform to the group. And was I free in that choice? I mean, we can play this game ad infinitum, but I think what I have difficulty with is if the true self comes out in any behavior, as if there is a self that's consistent across different behaviors and different patterns, and the essence will manifest itself by how I resolve my drug addiction or other addiction or other thing that I'm crazy about. And that could be in business, that could be writing a book, it could be anything, it could be drugs. Are you really free? And the point where you started down that road, and you can always attribute it to something else. I'm reminded when, you talk about the true self, Maimonides has a thing that, if somebody sins, you give them lashes and beat the shit out of them until they change their pattern behavior or acquiesce to the torture or the punishment that they've been subjected to. And the argument is that the true self of the person will manifest itself and become free through this punishment. And clearly, that's a difficult position to defend. But again, wrestling with what's free will on one level, and another level, does my behavior reflect my true self, as if I can define that, as if the true self will behave in this manner. Daniels will behave in one way and Bill will behave in another way, and his true self will manifest itself. That's another concept that I have difficulty with. So just throwing out some ideas.
Okay. Well, it's getting late now, but anyway, I think I'll conclude here. And first of all, I want to thank everybody who's still here. It was a great discussion, I thought. There was a lot of great ideas here. And also want to invite, next month, this last Sunday of the month is when I usually run these at about 3 p.m. Pacific time. Our topic's going to be on John Rawls' theory of justice, and we surveying his ideas as well as his critics. It's got critics from the left, from the right, from feminist philosophers, from all directions, and we'll have at that for a while. And I'll be posting a topic after that. But after that, I also want to again encourage anyone who's here, Lisa and Bill, who've expressed interest in leading a topic, or anyone else actually. If there's a topic in philosophy that you'd like to lead us on, by all means, let me know. We'll schedule that. Okay.
Can I make a suggestion along the lines of what Lisa suggested a couple hours ago around realism and the real and the unreal? It's a suggestion for a topic relating to that, which is, I think, because Lisa mentioned that she has a background in philosophy of science. I've studied closely a very important contribution to philosophy of science from about 50 years ago, Lakatos's methodology of scientific research programs, which was an article that talked about the way scientists have made scientific progress over human history and the way that they did it. Well, I won't summarize the article now. My suggestion is going to be that we might want to take a look at it as a way to address this question of what's real and how do people know what's real, how do scientists know what's real in order to test causal inferences. And just one idea from that paper that I think is very important that might be interesting to the folks in the room is the idea that scientists collect raw observations and then they code them into coded observations using coding rules. And those coding rules are based on a so-called observational theory. And that has been a necessary ingredient in scientific progress throughout human history. And so it's not just scientists who do that as well. Humans do that as well in all areas of everyday life. We have our raw sense data, and then we've got coding rules, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit in neurology from genetics or socialization that code the raw sense data into coded observations for decision-making purposes. So what this says about what's real and what's unreal is that the way human beings have to deal with the objective physical world out there in order to make decisions that are better rather than worse is we've got to, whether scientists or everyday people, we've got to code raw sense data about the objective world into coded observations that create in our minds, the scientists or the everyday person, in our minds kind of our observed version, like coded observations about what's out there that's real and what's not real, because that's the only way that scientists can do hypothesis testing. It's the only way that firms can do business decision making. And so we can, the point is we can never see the real objective world objectively. We can only see it through these coding rules that produce these coded observations, but that's good enough to test scientific hypotheses, to run businesses, to have democratic elections, to make policy, etc. And so, but that's the closest we ever get. And so the whole foundation for all I just said is Lakatos's article from 1970. And basically he lays out a case for how that's the best way to understand science, and it's the best way to understand human relationships with reality in general. So I think that might be interesting.
Right. Well, Bill, if you want to leave that topic, just let me know. We'll schedule it anytime you want. All right.
Okay. How do you spell that name? I'm trying to remember this theoretician.
You know something? I have a PDF of that paper on my computer, which I can put in the chat right now. So anyone who wants to read it can read it.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Okay, I'll do that. Hold on.
Well, thanks, Victor. I'm taking off.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
See you all next time.
All right.
Okay, I've got it in the buffer. I cut it, copied it to paste, and here's the chat. Let's see here. Paste. There it is. There's the paper. Wait, it's loading. Hold on a second. It's loading.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime,
to be honest, it's kind of long, so you might want to.
Okay.
Wait, real quick, Victor. It's kind of long, so you might want to skim it for the main bullet points.
Okay.
Because
how do you spell
like
his name?
I'll
find it. How do you spell his name?
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, Bill, you could also post it on the comments of the website, the meetup site.
There's the paper. Both the PDF and the spelling of his name are in the chat now.
Okay, I see it. All right. So again, thanks everybody who's here. Anybody final comments or anything? Or is that it? Okay. All right, thanks again, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.